Thank you, Professor Lang, for joining me on the podcast today. We haven't covered gun violence on policy chats in a couple of years, and as everyone knows, there have been a lot of developments since then. And so, to get our conversation started, I thought we would take a broad view of the issue. Can you maybe provide an overview of gun-related violence in recent years, and maybe contextualize it not only within the United States, but with the rest of the world as well, just to give us a good idea of where we stand.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on, Kevin. And yeah, definitely. I can. I'll start by saying that for a long period of time, go all the way back to the early '90s, we had seen kind of steady decline, you would say, in gun violence year over year. For most years, and there were a couple years from time to time where you'd have a little bit of an increase of a couple percentage points year over year, but then we'd see another downturn or decrease. Um, Gun violence started to rise a little bit more noticeably in 2015-16, but nothing compared to what we've seen over the last, we'll say, 5 years. And to give you some just kind of basic numbers for your audience, from 2018 to 2019, the firearm homicide deaths in the United States were around 14,000 and on it per year on average in 18 and 19, and that's increased to about 20,000 in 2020, 2021, those 2 years. So about a 42% increase. And when you look at that as a rate, it's about the same, 4.5 per 100,000 up to 6.3 per 100,000. Firearm suicide deaths, those have increased a little less so, but it's still an increase, kind of around 24,000 to 25,000 over that same kind of 4 year time frame. So we've seen a noticeable uptick in firearm deaths just overall. If you look at 2020 and 2021, and those numbers are still being updated, the 21 numbers, but I think we can be fairly confident in a trend since 2020. If you want to compare that to kind of maybe a more global scale, I think the natural place to first look is Canada. And Canada has seen an increase. It's two notable things about it. One is that they've seen an increase of about 12% in firearm homicide deaths in this 2018-19 compared to 2020-21. So it's not small, and when you compare that to other countries, it is noticeably bigger. But Canada is only looking at about 250 to 300 firearm homicide deaths per year, compared to the U.S., where we're looking at about 14, 15, 20,000 per year. Then you can look at the United Kingdom and Wales, and it's even a kind of a more stark picture. Their guns aren't legally allowed in a place like the UK or Wales, so they only have 25 to 30 deaths per year from gun homicides. So they saw an increase as well, but when you're dealing with such small numbers, it's really hard to put a lot of stock into that. And I think kind of so overall, you would say that yeah, the increase in the U.S. has been quite noticeable over the past 2 years, and I think everybody's seen those on the headlines, and there's strong data to back that up. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the noticeable increase in firearm purchases over that time period as well. So, and just again for context, we saw firearm background checks increase about 40% between 2019 and 2020. We saw firearm homicide deaths increase about 40% as well. So kind of that's certainly not causal, but certainly an interesting coincidence in terms of just the sheer number being around 40%.
Yeah, definitely. The correlation is definitely something to look into. I think something interesting you mentioned was not only the numbers where they go up or down. These last few years have been especially astounding, and obviously we'll talk about COVID in a little bit too, and with the impact that has had. But
Yeah.
before we get to that, I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the potential correlation or maybe even causation between political unrest, maybe economic unrest, inequality, other issues that affect the country as a whole, and how those problems play a role into gun-related violence. Because something that you noted, and this might be this was kind of shocking to me when I didn't know, was that more than half are actually suicides, and so That's a really that kind of makes you take a step back and makes you consider, the role mental health plays. So how would you say other issues affect gun violence in the United States?
That's a great question, and something that in my career I kind of noticed from the onset of when I was in graduate school, and I actually started and still would say that I worked in the mental health economic sphere, and kind of found myself wading into the firearm sphere for reasons that you alluded to, and um, to kind of dancing around your question to some degree, I would say that the relationship between firearm access and suicide is significantly stronger in the research than firearm access and homicide. And I think that the way that I've justified it throughout my career and kind of taken it all together is that, if someone is has a mental illness and is considering taking their own life, um, making it a little bit increasing the cost to that, and making a firearm acquisition more difficult, like a delay or something like that, that has a significant increase on whether it's a cooling off period. Just kind of some sort of stability can arise that could change somebody's decision. When it comes to something like a homicide, and a gun-related homicide, it does have a different feel to it. It doesn't, you don't, there, and I think there's merit to cooling off when it comes to homicides as well. But it certainly doesn't seem to have the same bite, at least in the data, that we see with suicide. So again, kind of dancing around your question, but kind of getting at this idea that relationship does seem noticeably stronger, and it does suggest that um, we would expect potentially some increases in suicides potentially if this increase in firearms persists over time that we've seen recently.
It's really interesting, and I think it also is really important, regardless of even what the data says, that what just because something correlates or those coincidences exist, like you mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean it's causation. And I think the next question I'm going to ask you probably expect is on COVID. Obviously, between everything that's happened the past couple of years, and as you mentioned, the increase in firearm sales. Before we get into that, I wanted to ask, how has COVID specifically affected things? Do you think that COVID changed any trends, or do you think the trends that we were viewing previously just kind of continued or maybe escalated?
I mean, that's I mean, the $1 million question right there. The thing with COVID is COVID increased uncertainty and just general uncertainty. And I actually, co-author and I did a paper really kind of mapping out the firearm purchases that came as a result of COVID. And we saw this significant increase and record-setting numbers of gun buying at the onset of COVID. And when we first set out on that project, we thought that there was going to be this kind of single spike in firearms, and we were going to analyze that and see how that maybe precipitated other types of gun violence potentially. But then the George Floyd riots happened, and that led to another kind of overtook the record-setting spike from March and April, and so we had another big spike in firearms. But I think the theme among both of those is that there was just an increase in uncertainty. And I think folks were looking and I think we can all kind of remember back 2 years ago, COVID almost seems like it's just kind of around now and we kind of just live with it. But back at that time, summer 2020, spring 2020, I think everybody was kind of just fearful and uncertain and didn't know whether they could call the police and have any help from the police. And so I think it was really led to this kind of mass increase in firearm sales, just as people became wanting to gather some control in such an uncertain world. So COVID certainly played a role on the firearm side. In terms of the homicide or violent side, we do see a little bit of an increase in firearm homicides, like I mentioned, leading up to the pandemic. But then we see it increase even more so in 2020 and 2021. So, gosh, to say that that's causal is so touchy, right? If we say, there's no kind of story in my head that says, okay, there's a pandemic, then gun violence should go up. That's not that I don't see that story really emerging. But I do think that there's fear, there's uncertainty, and now, like you said, you mentioned the economic backdrop, prices, unemployment, things like that. That's those things are not. This is not a good time, I think, in people's lives to go through 2 years of uncertainty and then have to pay $100 at the gas pump. So
I
just I
really,
mean, uncertainty is just unhappiness.
yeah, and I was gonna say I really, really like the way you put it. In that uncertainty, and again, it comes back to that what we mentioned earlier about the causation versus correlation and how that is really sensitive. But the fact that there is that uncertainty and things in a lot of people's minds are have gotten worse in various ways. And then when and you mentioned the gas prices, there are so many moving parts that it even if you can't see the correlation, the causation in the data, it does make you think that increased uncertainty and increased social instability does, in some capacity, play a role in that. Um, we've talked a bit about about trends and the issues. I want to also talk about the policies. You know, that's something that I always find really interesting when it comes to the gun control and gun debate. Is that the policies, the solutions, seem to always be secondary to the more heated political debate. But I always found that really interesting, and there are a lot of various ideas that have been proposed. I know President Biden also had a program a few months back. So, can you outline some of the main policies that have been implemented by the country in the past maybe a few decades to tackle gun violence, and maybe even highlight some policies that haven't been implemented that you think should be maybe explored a little bit more?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so, the place that I'll kind of go back to is the Brady bill back in '94. And one of a really interesting paper came from that, and it's a more recent paper, but it really exploited the wait periods that came out of that, because there were wait periods a little bit beforehand, and then there was a time period during the Brady, kind of right after the Brady bill was implemented, that everybody was subject to wait periods, and it kind of went away as we went to this background check system. And the authors exploited the differential across states in terms of wait periods. So when states had it turned on versus turned off. And ultimately, what they found was that the delays in purchasing were associated with a reduction in suicide. And I think that kind of goes back to that point where, I kind of alluded to that already. But yeah, if there is some sort of again, cooling off period or something like that, I think that that does seem to show itself in the data. And the thing that I like to compare it to is, if somebody's going out, and I'm not a hunter by any means, but if somebody's going to go out and they're getting ready for hunting season, they're not sitting there saying like, oh my gosh, I got to go buy a gun tomorrow because hunting season starts tomorrow. They know when hunting season starts, and if they're going to upgrade their firearm, they're going to do that in kind of they don't need to do that in a very urgent manner. And so I think it was interesting to see that delay did seem to have an effect on suicide. The evidence on homicide is a little bit mixed, and as we kind of said before, that's a little bit harder to pin down causally. The other law that's been shown to be quite effective from a we'll say suicide perspective for sure, and maybe a little, there's some evidence from a homicide perspective as well, is child access prevention laws. So these safe storage laws that you probably have heard of before. And so when those laws are implemented, authors have found a significant reduction in suicide of juveniles. And same thing with they're a little bit less strong, but there's still some evidence for firearm homicides as well on the juvenile side. So those two laws in particular kind of stand out to me as having some sort of bite, especially from the mental health side, from the firearm suicide perspective. Um, it's probably worth mentioning a little bit. Just concealed carry is something that's in the news often, and there's been work on that. It's kind of divided. It's kind of hard to disentangle who really has concealed carry permits and how that relates to some outcome. The part of the issue is that firearm ownership is just such a private matter, and people don't want to share anything. But this is kind of going the other direction, but there is evidence that when there's gun-related homicides in an area, there's an increase in concealed permit applications in the area. So kind of going the other direction. So as kind of it's suggestive of wanting some protection. So again, that to me that's not like, there is some urgency to that. I don't want to downplay it, but it's certainly, if there was a delay or a process that was involved with that, you would certainly be okay with that as long as you felt safe in the end. But all this is kind of under the umbrella of the background check system. And so the background check system was part of this Brady bill. And so now when you buy a firearm from a federal licensed dealer, they do run a background check. And it's about a 2-minute background check. And it's ultimately, is your name on the list or not, is kind of a way to think about it. And in practice, it certainly makes sense, but in reality, if you go look at the number of people on the list in Pennsylvania, for example, it goes from like 0 to 700,000 in 1 year, and so it's not quite as smooth, I think, as it was intended to be. So
Definitely. And I think the background check conversation is always really interesting as well. And I guess a question stemming from that is I know states have various policies, and there was also a lot of talk about the Supreme Court overruling the New York policy. And so, just very briefly, can you maybe outline, are there any like policies that states have adopted that seem to have worked, or maybe the opposite? Are there certain things that states have tried that have done, the opposite? Is there anything that's any role that states have played that is significant to talk about?
yeah, and we could get in a little bit to the Supreme Court ruling. It's funny because New York, that stringent gun law stems all the way back to the 1900s, the early 1900s, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but that actually there's a study that showed that law that kind of started that gun stringent gun law in New York, I think it was in like 1915 or something, had a reduction in firearm suicide as well. So that kind of persists. But I think probably more to your point would be the red flag laws. I think those, when I think of kind of like states trying to implement something that would reduce firearm violence, these red flag laws have received a lot of attention. And what those are essentially, if you know somebody or the police know somebody that has a firearm that is a threat to themselves or society at large, they can get essentially a warrant, or they can ask a judge to have somebody's firearm taken away from them. And this obviously has led to some concerns for people who are strongly on the gun rights side of things, which is understandable. But what they found, and I think this has come up a lot throughout this summer, where we've seen different events, whether it's in Chicago or Oregon or Buffalo, these red flag laws are hard to enact, or hard to actually carry out. I've been kind of thinking myself as to why it has been so difficult for that to be the case, to actually carry these out. And I think it comes back to the sensitivity of the issue and the sensitivity of just firearms in general. If you have a cousin, for example, that you're concerned about, and you're sincerely concerned about their well-being, and you don't think that having a firearm right now would be a good thing, you're risking your relationship with that person if you say, hey, I went to a judge and they're going to take your gun now. Like, you have no idea how that's going to play out. And so I think on paper, something like a red flag law is great. Like, I can see why people like it, but I think in practice, like the way to make that work well is just, I don't, it's not quite, it's a little more nuanced than that. And a lot of people cite, there are a couple like early studies of red flag laws. I forget the states, like the earliest states had these. Uh, but the one concern with these is if you just look at a state singularly, you do risk, or one or two states, you do kind of risk. Uh, it's difficult to identify a causal relationship between something like a single law and then some sort of outcome. So they need to be taken with a grain of salt. I see the potential in them, but it's certainly not cut and dry.
Definitely. And that's something I never even considered, the fact that the sensitivity of the issue, even in just conversation, let alone in
Hmm.
actual practice, is in and of itself a hurdle that we need to think about and overcome.
Yeah,
It, it's so multifaceted and there's so many layers to it that
yeah.
it's really interesting. One policy that I do want to talk about, because it was very popular and discussed in the 2020 Democratic primaries, was the gun buyback or
Hmm.
firearm buyback. First, is this even feasible, like on a large scale? I think that's one of the main concerns I saw back then, was the
Hmm.
feasibility of it, and if it were feasible, because it's some proponents of it were asking essentially for it to be an option. Um, it, would that actually work? Would people actually want to give their guns back or sell their guns back to the government? Is this something that we should even be thinking about, or is this one of those policies that's just too far out there?
Yeah, that's it's funny that when I think about the idea of a gun buyback, especially like you said, as kind of when the political season was ramping up, I kind of wanted to like show them that that train just left. Like it just left like a second ago. We had, to give you just again some context, and these are not numbers to be taken. It's not quite the percentage that you want to use it as, but in 2020 there were almost 40 million background checks for firearms. So that's over 10% of the population. Now, 10% of the U.S. population is over that. Now, not all of those were associated with a firearm purchase. There's lots of different ways that background checks can take place, but you're looking at just an immense amount of background checks. And so the way I thought about it is that that train just left. So the idea of offering a gun buyback, that's fine. That's fine. Now requiring it is, I think, a little bit. That's obviously going to be a more sensitive issue. If it's involuntary, you're not going to get any traction on that. But I think that a lot of people do like to cite Australia's gun buyback program back in the 90s, and the thing that's different about there is that you did have some household support for that. That was, you ended up having a reduction in the fraction of households owning guns by 50%. And kind of consistent with everything that is in the literature and in the research, that's been shown to have reduced firearm suicide rates quite a bit, but not as much effect on homicides. And so again, kind of consistent with everything we've seen, this gun buyback. If we had a very large scale gun buyback in the United States, that would be one of the hypotheses you would make. You'd say, yeah, I think this could have a potential impact on firearm suicide rates. But the thing about the U.S. is kind of, I feel like we're wired a little bit differently when it comes to gun buybacks. And as you kind of suggested that maybe you were feeling the same way, like, is this even feasible? Um, since you're talking to economists, I feel like I'm obligated to say that it is feasible if the United States wants to pay a lot of money for those guns, right? So now I feel like there's some arbitrage in all of that. If you have a lot of guns and they're buying back your guns for $1 million a piece, then you're just going to sell your guns, buy more, and retire somewhere. So in that sense, it doesn't seem like something that you'd really be able to pull off. Now, having said that, I mean, the argument for it is that if you take away all the guns in an area, yeah, you'd probably have less gun violence, assuming that everybody gave up their gun, assuming you got rid of all the guns. But I think you kind of mentioned that like there may be concerns of maybe some adverse selection. If everybody that wants to sell back their gun sells back their gun, that's great. But what about the people who maybe didn't get their gun legally? Maybe what about the people who don't want to use it, who want to use it for nefarious things? Those are the people that are left with guns. So you kind of just isolated the situation, but you didn't fix it. So, but yeah, it's something that I don't think you're going to hear that much about it in the future because I think there's just literally too many guns out there.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that there are more guns than there are Americans in the US. And so that was one of the reasons why I was also why my tone was a little bit questioning because and it just seemed so out there. And also that's something
Mhm.
I didn't even think about, the idea that people could just sell their guns and then go buy more with that money. That was something I had never even considered.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and if you want people to sell their guns, I mean, if you just pay them a lot of money, so you
at
know,
some point everyone will break. Yeah, that's a good point. But then again, the feasibility of it and how much it would cost.
yeah, we've printed enough money in the last couple of years, so we don't need to do any more for that.
Yeah, and the current economic climate, yeah, would be questionable at the very least. One thing that we've kind of touched somewhat but haven't answered directly are the misconceptions around gun control, gun violence. I think one of them, maybe to a lesser extent, is the fact that a lot of gun related deaths are suicides. But what are some other major misconceptions that you see talked about? I know social media is a breeding ground for misconception, and especially on such a sensitive topic. What are some things that you wish more people knew about this conversation?
Yeah, bring me back to the fold if I get too out there on the deep end here. But I think that, as much as we talk about firearms as a polarizing topic in gun policy, and we talk about, gun control advocates and gun rights advocates, and they're two very completely different people, types of individuals. Um, we think that there's this massive partisan divide when it comes to firearms. Um, and I don't believe that. Like in all the work I've done on this, I don't think that the the overlap between gun rights and gun control are that far off. I think there's more overlap than like you said, the social media or media in general just want to admit. And so there's a couple things to that point is that the Pew Research Center, they do surveys all the time. They kind of do updated surveys, and they did one from back in 2021. Just asked folks about their feelings towards gun policies and gun laws based on their political leaning. And what you find that if you break down different gun laws into you break them in a little more nuance than just like, everyone has a gun or no one has a gun, you see that there's some policies where they're split. So like banning assault style weapons, that's more of a split policy. The database of tracking gun sales, like that's a little bit more split. Allowing guns in more places like schools, that's again split along party lines. But when it comes to like preventing people with mental illness from purchasing guns or requiring background checks at gun shows, requiring concealed carry permits and things like that, like there's more overlap than not, even across political lines. And so, we hear this kind of, you're either kind of with us or against us kind of climate. That seems like to be the climate we're in politically. But when you kind of break it down, it's not quite that polarizing. To that point, I mentioned the paper that I was a part of with regards to the increase in firearms after COVID, and then during the George Floyd riots. Both of these big jumps. Something to note about them is that they were bipartisan jumps. So you didn't have the COVID onset take place, and then all of a sudden, like people in Montana and people in Alabama started, in Texas started buying guns. The increase in firearm sales was essentially the same rate in places like Rhode Island as they were in Michigan, as they were in North Dakota, and things like that. And now that's, you can parse it out, and there's obviously differences on the margin, but in the end, if you look at the red states versus blue states, there was just kind of a universal increase. And so that, you could kind of say, well, maybe it's just the red folks in blue states buying firearms, but there's some evidence that about 50% of those firearms purchased during those spikes were from first-time gun owners. So you're looking at a new set of gun owners, for better or for worse. I don't know if it's less about that and more about the fact that folks I do think they're responding to this uncertainty. And I don't think that we don't need to get into the debate about whether like a more uncertain world is really bad or good. But I think folks can kind of look to self-protection as a common ground in these uncertain times. And kind of to that point, uh, we did have the most meaningful firearm legislation in U.S. in decades back in late June, early July. That was the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And so it was nice for me to see that we had, and it sounds like a small number, but I actually think in this climate it's a big deal that we had more than 10% of Republicans in our Congress that voted in favor of law, right? So it kind of, we did see a little bit of this cross-party movement, which is kind of nice to see. Because I don't think that the world is as polarized as we might think it seems on the media or in social media or however you want to, wherever you get your news. Um, but kind of, against that is that this was full of moderate provisions, right? This was not like, we're going to make this big, huge impact on firearms and firearm ownership and make it that much more difficult. So I wouldn't expect there to be a big impact on this particular law, but I think what it does is it does open up the conversation a little bit. And I think that's where I am not the person that I believe that folks are trying to reduce firearm violence. And I think that lots of stuff just get kind of caught up in the mix. Lots of things that aren't related to that get caught up in all this and however Congress works. But I, the biggest misconception I see is that there's actually more overlap than not, kind of taking it all together. And I guess I'd be remiss to say if I didn't say that it is a little disappointing that it had taken so long to get some sort of firearm legislation passed. It took the heartbreaking tragedies of the spring and early summer in New York and Texas to get any type of dialogue. So my hope is that this gives us a sense that we can we can improve firearm legislation without upsetting everybody, right? I think there is some common ground that people can find, and it's all about just trying to eliminate the loss of innocent lives. And I think if we can keep that in mind, then maybe the media can sell things however they want, but if we can keep our eye on that, I think there can be some progress made.
I think that's a really, really nice a note to bring up the fact that there is more common ground, and ultimately everyone does want to reduce the numbers, and we do want to protect as many people as possible. And although there are areas that many disagree on, on political lines and based on where they land, that the common ground is still there. And I think the way you framed it is really nice. That even though the policy back in July, that doesn't necessarily change the landscape, but it does start a conversation. Kind of I think it's really nice to end on a positive note. To wrap things up, I wanted to ask, like, I know social media and media in general, like you mentioned, does also play a major role when it comes to what people believe and if people are well informed. Overall, would you say that social media and even traditional media as well, have they done, has there been a net positive impact when it comes to the education of people? And this is a really broad question. It can be applied to many other issues, but specifically on gun control, has there been a net positive, would you say, when it comes to people being educated on this issue? And I guess this could be applied, like I said, to other issues as well. But because when you go on social media, there seems to be so much misinformation. But I've also seen many argue that social media is a great way, and the internet is a great way for people to access information that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. To kind of end things off, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess it's funny to think that I might get myself in trouble here, and we might not end off on such a positive note as talking about politicians, right? So, and political lines. But yeah, I think you mentioned that it's not just firearm policy when it comes to trying to find uh, solid and reliable information. It's difficult, and I think it's difficult in this day and age. And when it comes to something like social media, what it's really done is it means that we have access to every piece of information on every subject all the time. It's like, is that, and you could ask yourself the follow-up question is that information correct? And it's really, really hard to disentangle. Um, I would say, and this is my own personal opinion. Um, I would say that the cable news networks have really failed us. It's a real shame because and people joke about it, and there's a reason that they joke about it. Like it's reality TV, and you think about I was thinking the other day, like, how many 24-hour cable news networks do we have? I mean, we've got what, four or five main ones, and it's like, and they're all saying the same thing with a different person yelling, and I just, it just has become, and it's hard because, as an economist, I see what the allure is, right? It sells, because if you were, you think about my response to, what's the misconception? It's like, well, the misconception is that, people might get along better than we think. Like, that's not going to sell. That's not a good story. Nobody wants to hear that people are getting along. People would rather hear, like, oh, there's going to be like a fight that breaks out to decide some sort of policy. Like, that's like more entertaining. And the news, I feel like these cable news networks have kind of moved to saying like, yeah, that's a good way to get viewers, because it is. And it's, so I think that's really disappointing. And and again, this is kind of wading off into the weeds a little bit, but I ended up somehow, I have no idea. I'm trying to track it down, but I ended up with COVID early in the summer, and was trying to find out information about this Omicron BA.5. And I'm running between the CDC and the news, and then like Twitter feeds of doctors. And you're kind of inundated with like, well, who do I believe? Because some of these really well-renowned doctors are like, the CDC's not guiding you in the right direction. 5 days not enough, and it's really hard. So to that point, it's really hard to find out where to get the best information, because it might be Twitter, which is also where the worst information is too. So how do you get good information? For me, I actually read less about firearms on social media, because I read through the literature and the research, and that's a little bit easier to dissect. I think maybe it's incumbent upon academics to do more papers and maybe get their articles and their information out to a more wide read audience, or wider audiences. The problem with that is that, again, none of it is like that exciting. It doesn't. It's you're not going to have a pay-per-view on like a academic research article. But hopefully that maybe there'll be a repository that people can all rely on at some. I know there are some out there, but it's not quite the mainstream. But if we can get to a little bit more mainstream um, uh, understanding, that'd be really nice. So.
Thank you, Dr. Lang. It is so difficult. I think you framed it perfectly. It is so difficult when you have so much information, and I definitely hear what the other side says on the fact that in a lot of ways the access is a good thing, and in a lot of ways it sounds like it's more of a gray area where it does come down to the individual to really go out of their way, and many people either can't do that or choose not to. Some prefer to stay in their own bubbles, and that limits that. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual. It's so difficult to get through all of that.
Yeah, and we also, I mean, not everybody has a limited bandwidth, right? And again, kind of going back to just what's going on just in the world today, whether it's some people are really focused on housing today. That's a big issue, and it's not. It makes a lot of sense that people are saying, I'm not sure what's going to happen with my housing situation. Maybe I should go learn about legislation and firearms. Like, that's not the priority order. So it is hard to kind of ask folks to be on top of that when there's so many other really pressing concerns. So, but yeah, I would like to see the cable news networks do a little bit better.
It would be nice, yeah. It would be really nice, and also a lot on social media as well. I think that there's a lot of untapped potential there for factual, objective news, and there are some smaller, organizations and individuals doing that, but it's like you said, it's not the mainstream yet.
Yeah, exactly.
But that said, Professor Lang, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to discuss one of the most important issues, an issue we haven't talked about in such a long time.
Great. No, I appreciate it, Kevin. Let me know anytime. I'm happy to come back.
Definitely. And I'm sure there will be updates in the future too. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Have a good one.